Timothy Geithner talks about dealing with the 2007-2008 financial crisis as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and later as President Obama's Treasury Secretary. This is about an hour.
So I have a pretty simple question to start. Why did you write your book? Andrew Ross Sullivan said in the New York Times that as much as you hate to explain, you very much want to be understood. Is that true?
There was, okay, why did I write the book? Good question. I never thought I would. Because, you know, I have a hard time sitting still, and it takes a fair amount of patience to do it. But I wanted to give people a sense of what it was like to have a chance to look at these choices we faced through our eyes. Because they were pretty bad choices. And I think it's still really hard for people to understand why this was necessary, why it was sensible, why it was better than the alternatives. And I thought that was worth a shot. And I wanted to give our successors, because, you know, we're going to face financial crises in the future, and they're devastating. I wanted to give our successors a better framework for making these choices and a better understanding of the mix of things we did, what worked, what didn't work, so that when they face this kind of mess in the future, they can make better choices and do a better job of limiting the damage. Those were my motivations.
So your central argument, I think, is that in a time of financial crisis, governments need to appear to reward the very institutions that are failing in order to save the rest of us from the effects of the crisis. And you write, in these severe cases, government needs to lean in against the forces of gloom, borrowing more, spending more, and exposing taxpayers to more short-term risk, even if it looks profligate, even if it seems to reward incompetence and venality, even if it fuels perceptions of an out-of-control, money-spewing, bailout-crazed big government. So talk about that.
That was well said. Thank you.
I like to plagiarize.
Well, you know, what I try to explain is that financial panics, the really severe type of panic, they happen very rarely. And to protect people from the consequences of the crash, the mass unemployment that follows panics, you have to do the deeply counterintuitive thing, the kind of the opposite of what normally makes sense in response to a typical financial crisis. So again, in a typical recession or a typical case of a financial institution failing, you know, you should basically let the fire burn, let the losses happen. You can do that with relative confidence that it's not going to spread to the responsible and the strong. You can do it with less risk of contagion. And the benefit of acting that way is that you'll hopefully get incentives better. And maybe in the future, at the margin, you reduce the risk that behavior that caused the failure is looked at as attractive. So there's a pretty good moral hazard argument in the typical crisis for doing those things. But in a panic, you got to do the opposite. Because if you let the fire burn too hot, you let the run gain momentum, then it'll overwhelm your defenses. It'll imperil the weak, the strong, not just the weak. And you risk mass unemployment. And it's not a hypothetical risk. I mean, you know, if you just look at the centuries of financial crises, look at the 50 years of crises before the Great Depression, look at the Great Depression, or look at the last 8 emerging market financial crises of the 90s, and you can see what happens when governments stand back in the face of runs and panics in the hope they burn themselves out, or out of some aversion to political risk, or aversion to looking like they're rewarding the arsonists. And when they let the thing burn in that context, it's like devastating. And it's not important that it's devastating to investors or shareholders of banks or managers of banks. What's important is it's devastating to the innocent victims. So again, just remember the Great Depression. You know, of course, we had no memory of that. Most Americans have no memory of that. But, you know, unemployment went to 25%. And the economy fell by 25%. And then we had a decade of soup lines and shanty towns across the country, really around the world. And in this crisis, in the fall of 2008, the size of the financial shock at that stage in the crisis was 5 times greater than what happened at the beginning of the Great Depression. So the risks were grave and severe and potentially catastrophic, and to protect people from the consequence, or to do as much as we could to protect the consequence, you had to use overwhelming force to keep the lights on in the financial system. Even though it looked deeply unfair, even though it seemed counterintuitive, even though it had moral hazard risk, even though it required taking a lot of financial risk. But if we hadn't done that, then we would face the certainty of dramatically worse economic outcomes, even than the terrible ones we experienced. So that's the basic thesis of the book, and you know, it's not an easy thing to make compelling to people, I think, except that if you remember back what it was like in October of '08, when a bunch of people, for the right reasons mostly, had let the fire burn too hot, it was devastating. It was just devastating. And it was only because because we're the United States, we were able to put overwhelming force behind the system and into the economy that we contained the damage to even the pretty severe levels that we faced. And we're still living with those scars.
How do you find that line between when you should let the fire burn and when you need to do the opposite and step in with overwhelming force? And how do you expect the market to know where that line is?
Excellent question. I think it's the best question, because you know there's this terrible fog of diagnosis at the beginning, because you can't be sure how vulnerable you are to the thing tipping over into panic. You can't be sure. And in our crisis, although it followed a long boom, and we had many of the preconditions for pretty severe crisis, and there were observable vulnerabilities. You know, this thing basically started in July of '07, and it was a sort of a slow burn for a year, mostly limited to the periphery of the financial system. Periphery, I mean, Bear Stearns and the investment weren't really the periphery, but it wasn't really threatening the core of the financial system. And the effects on the economy up to that point were pretty modest, so it's pretty hard to judge. So in the book, I try to explain how you should think through the choices. The right response initially is to let the fire burn and let it do what it has to do, which is to consume the weakest institutions. That's the rational response. But you just got to be careful that it doesn't get away from you. It doesn't get so much momentum that it becomes much harder to arrest in that context, and that's just a hard line to strike. But if you step in too quickly and protect every institution because you're too worried about the panic, you'll make a different kind of error, an error that might raise the risk of financial crises, you know, bigger crises in the future. So it's a hard balance to strike. In the United States, because we didn't come into this crisis with enough authority, we were late to escalate. You know, had to let the terror shock Congress into acting before we had a broader set of tools to do enough to get our arms around, you know, slow the pace of the run. We were just late to escalate because of that limitation on authority.
So a lot of people are mad, and they're still probably going to be mad after reading your book. I thought Jon Stewart put it pretty memorably. He said, this is like an optical illusion. One person looks at it and you see a pretty girl, and then you flip it and the other person looks at it and sees, you can watch it for yourself, I can't use Jon Stewart's language. Anyway, but do you think you can ever succeed in erasing the perception by a large chunk of the population that this was all wrong and all unfair?
I mean, it's completely understandable anger and rage still, because the scars of the crisis, it was just so brutal in the damage, and we're still living with the scars of that. Unemployment is still alarmingly high. You've had, you know, catastrophic damage to people's savings and sense of security. You know, we went into the crisis pretty high rates of poverty, much worse today. People's perception of inequality and mobility opportunity substantially worsened by the crisis. And how could you expect people to understand why it was necessary or just to protect the institutions that were the center of the crisis, who then turned around and paid themselves pretty generous bonuses for a long time? How could you expect people to understand that? I don't think it's understandable. But I can tell you with complete confidence, and again, it's not a hypothetical, theoretical thing, that the alternative of letting the thing collapse and trying to protect people after that from the damage would have been deeply irresponsible and I think immoral to do because of the cost of damage to people's livelihood would have been much, much, much worse than we faced. And again, hard to make that compelling too, because again, this country had not experienced anything like this, anything like a classic panic since the Great Depression. And really no memory of the series of Great Depressions we had following the panics of the financial crises of the previous 50 years before that. So hard thing to expect people to understand, and I don't think that's achievable. But it's still important, not that people will agree, but it's still important, I think, for those of us who were there trying to sort through these bad options to try to give you a better feel for why we did what we did, why we made those choices. Because that's worth doing, even if I think, and I have low expectations for whether you can make it seem acceptable, understandable.
So your first...
By the way, I don't remember. I think John Stewart was more vivid than you said, but
he was more vivid than
I don't think this was pretty. I don't think you can look at this and say, "Oh, it was this cool, elegant thing." It was a messy, horrible, tragic thing. It just would have been dramatically worse if we had done what most people argued we should do.
So your first real public performance as Treasury Secretary was in early February 2009. Those were dark days and the country was looking to you. And you write, "It's fair to say the speech did not go well. I swayed back and forth like an unhappy passenger on an unsteady ship. I tried to sound forceful, but I just sounded like someone trying to sound forceful." You said that Larry Summers actually came to your office and said, "I can't tell you what to do, but I wouldn't give a speech like this." So no, seriously, as a life question, how do you hang in there through that, especially when you don't get to go home and curl up in a ball on your bed?
Barney Frank said that when I appeared in public, it was like it was at my bar mitzvah. Well, I made this decision, which I think was the right decision, even in retrospect, to go out and lay out this framework for the next stage of our strategy at a pretty early time when we didn't have all the details yet of how we were actually going to do it. Because I thought the vacuum was pretty damaging at that point. People were filling the vacuum with all sorts of ideas and expectations for what we should do, which we weren't going to do. And I needed to suck the hope out of the air about some of the stuff people wanted us to do. And I needed to have a device to try to force a little bit of end to the debates we were having internally about what to do. Because if you could sit there and debate these things forever because it all sucks. And if you let people argue about it forever, you'll never decide anything. So I made a choice to go early with a general framework, no details, not enough details. And there were a lot of things in that framework, a pretty scary framework, because the stress test, the title of my book, the device we used to recapitalize the banking system, was something people never heard of before. There's no precedent for it. And it was a little alarming because most people were still living with the hope that we were going to have the government come in and go buy from these banks a bunch of these bad assets at inflated prices as a way to keep the banks alive. They wanted us to do, I know this sounds inexplicable because most people thought what we do was way too generous, but what people wanted us to do then, even internally, was to do something much more generous to the bank shareholder and the banks than we did, and I needed to suck the hope out of the air for that. So it was I said it was a terrible speech, and I wasn't great at doing that. But we had a bigger problem too, which is that I made this choice to go early, pretty general, with a framework that had a lot of uncertainty in it, and that was it made everything a little more scary even than it was then. But we did what I said we would do. Everything I said we would do, we did. Not all of it had as much traction or power as we hoped, but the overall effect of that strategy was much more effective than even we thought at the time, because the economy when we started was shrinking at an annual rate of about 8%. We were losing 750,000 jobs a month. And within 6 months, the economy was growing at 3%. Incredibly rapid turnaround for a world economy that was at the edge of collapse. And that was because of the force and the strength of what fiscal stimulus delivered, what the Fed's policy delivered, and the scale of that strategy, the sort of the content of the strategy that I first laid out in that not well-received speech.
So let's retrace some of the steps that led to that moment. You were a career public servant, but you somewhat accidentally developed a specialty in financial crises from Mexico to Asia. And I love this line. Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, said, whenever there was a crisis, Tim was there. But you didn't cause the crisis caused you.
I think he probably thought I caused some of them, but he was being gracious. Yeah, I grew up overseas mostly, and I decided, having had that experience living in India and Thailand, studying in China, that I wanted to, you get to watch your country from a different vantage point and see the enormous effect we can have in the world, mostly for good, but not always for good. And I decided that I wanted to at least spend part of my life trying to affect those decisions. And so I went to the Treasury pretty early in life as a civil servant. 1988, I was 27, I think, 28, and I never thought I would do it for long. But I had this really rewarding experience of working with people that were really excellent, completely ethical. There was we had this sort of naive existence where politics rarely got in the way of, or in a negative way, interfered with the choices about policy. And as you said, I had this experience of watching and being there and being part of or helping or observing a bunch of countries deal with pretty devastating financial crises. Very valuable experience. I had no idea how valuable, but very valuable experience, because I lived in Japan, worked in Japan, just as their economy was collapsing. Watched how they embraced a strategy of kind of mostly sideways drift, for a long time. Didn't do much to clean up the financial system. Looked at the cost of that, and then of course watched the emerging economies blow themselves up in rapid succession. That was a very good experience to go through, and it taught me a lot about how fragile these systems are, how damaging they can be when they fall apart. It gave me a good lesson in the typical mistakes governments make over and over again. It was a great lesson in the importance of overwhelming force. It was we fought, debated each of those times, all these classic moral hazard debates that were sort of present in our crisis. It was a good education in humility in crises.
So the night before your first day of work as president of the New York Federal Reserve, what happened?
Well, I was. They asked me to go to come run the New York Fed in the fall of 2003, and my kids were in school in Washington then, and I wasn't going to move them in the school year, so I went and rented an apartment in New York. And my first night in New York, I went to buy some stuff for breakfast, and I bought a six-pack of beer, and I was carded. And that was a somewhat awkward beginning. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your time as president of the New York Fed. Your chapter in your book is called Leaning Against the Wind, and you talk about your growing fears about some things, about what came to be known as the shadow banking system, all the stuff going outside of the regulated banking system, and your work to clean up the derivatives market. Your critics aren't having it. After the release of the Federal Reserve's transcripts from its 2008 policy meetings, the Wall Street Journal branded you as one of its losers, in part because you said in early 2008, in the financial markets, I think it's true that there is some sign that the process of repair is starting, and Bear Stearns collapsed just a few weeks later. So Talk about this. Were you really leaning against the wind?
Well, I try to talk very honestly, openly about the stuff we missed and the stuff we tried, why it failed, why it was so inadequate. And I described I try to do a fair job of going through this, of laying out the things that I described that I thought were reassuring about our system, even going into the crisis, and things that were troubling. But let's just do the basic. Let's just do the basic contours of our system at that point, so it give you some feel for what it was like to see it then. You know, what happened in our system is over the decades that followed the Great Depression, as the memory of the panic faded, our financial system completely outgrew the safeguards we put in place around banks after the Great Depression. So that, in that case, we had a major financial panic. We put in place a bit of constraints on banks, deposit insurance, and the Fed had a sort of protection, safety net provided as part of the lender's last resort function. And over time, we evolved in the United States in that long boom. They call it the quiet period of decades. This set of other institutions that were not constrained in terms of capital or leverage, had no access to deposit insurance or the safety net for the system. And we evolved over time in Fannie and Freddie, as you've written about eloquently, the investment banks, some big insurance companies, GE Capital, and a whole universe of non-bank financial institutions. This whole complicated world of essentially banks. More risky than banks because they were not constrained in terms of leverage, and more risky than banks because they had no access to deposit insurance protection against runs. And in our system, the Fed's reach was limited to a part of the banking system. But the banking system was only about 40% of the financial system in credit. And that other 60% was much more risky, very vulnerable to runs. And when I got to the New York Fed in that fall of '03, I think what worried me most was that big mismatch between where there was risk, where there were constraints, where there was somebody nominally in charge, and the scope of the firefighting authority that even we had. Because you know that when things fell apart, which they might do, people generally say, well, where's the Fed? What are you going to do about it? They come ask us for money. And we had pretty limited tools at that point. So that troubled me a lot. And I wrote a fair amount about what, in the face of that, we tried to do to lean against the forces of optimism that were causing this big boom in leverage and risk. But as I write, those efforts were, of course, very weak against the force of the boom, inadequate, late, insufficient. Not because there wasn't a lot to worry about, but because we had no direct authority over institutions where most of the risk was. And even where we had authority, like over banks, we didn't think about forcing them to hold capital against the risk of a Great Depression. Because people thought Great Depressions can't happen in the United States. They seemed inconceivable. Now we took those lessons and tried to reshape the rules of the game in the financial system because of the costly lessons in that context, and those lessons I think informed what are very powerful, promising designer reforms that we're now putting into place. But yeah, we missed a lot and didn't do enough in advance.
So bring us back to the fall of 2008 and try to explain the sheer amount of fear there's a great story in the book about a conversation you had with Lloyd Blankfein around then. Well,
sort of a gathering storm or, burning fire, getting a lot of momentum, and by the fall of 2008, the system really was at the edge of collapse, and it was happening around the world. And with what people call Lehman Weekend, that weekend we brought the major institutions together at the New York Fed to try to figure out a way to contain the damage and avert default by the biggest institutions. At that weekend, Lehman and Merrill Lynch and AIG were all basically at collapse, and if they collapsed, the system was going to fail. And although we were able to find us a solution to Merrill Lynch and AIG, without a willing buyer for Lehman, we had no good option. So in the weeks after that, when the system was basically breaking down, and there was a classic run across the system, I got a phone call one morning from from this very prominent banker, and at maybe 6:30 I was at my desk, and I called him back right afterwards and said, you have to get that out of your voice. Don't talk to anybody else in your firm or outside, because if they hear you, it'll be terrible. And I say, you can replace it with anger or whatever you want, but you can't let people hear you. But as I explain in my book, if you were aware, then you were scared to death. And it was the people who weren't scared that you had to worry about the most. The people who were scared were the more smart and the more competent.
Was there anybody who actually wasn't scared?
Yeah, I mean, remember what after Lehman,
That's true.
that morning after Lehman, the Wall Street Journal editorial page and the New York Times editorial page thought it was terrific. They said, thank goodness they didn't step in and find a solution to prevent default. They thought it was going to be a just, virtuous, excellent imposition of pain against on the deserving. It would have no effect on the rest of us. That was the dominant view of the time. So, yeah, there were a lot of people, who thought going into the weekend, all of Washington was caught in this fever of saying there had been too much rescuing going on, no more rescues. Now, then they got scared to death, and they, gave President Bush and Hank Paulson the authority that we needed in the end to put out the fire. But yeah, there were a huge number of people still who I had no sense for how perilous it was.
But you argue there was no desire to enforce moral hazard at work in the decision not to save Lehman. It was purely what you could do.
It's an important thing to I know it seems inexplicable, but in finance it's not like national security. We don't give the President of the United States the standing authority to put out financial fires. We don't do it because of moral hazard concerns. We think if you do that, then investors will take too much risk because they'll live with the expectation that the government will come in to protect them. So our president, even in the United States, came into with no authority except to declare a bank holiday or close the equity markets. Not things that are helpful in a panic. So the tragic failure in some sense of the country going into this, among the many failures, was we didn't have the tools to contain the damage early enough. Ultimately, we were able to do it, but not until a lot of damage was baked into the outcomes. So the Fed, also by design, limited tools. I write in my book about how when I went to the New York Fed initially in 2003, they showed me this book they called the Doomsday Book, and I thought, oh, this would be cool, and it was terrifying because it was 3 inches thick. But when I looked at it, which I did carefully, it was a pretty limp, weak set of things. Because again, by design, people who created the authority for the Fed didn't want the Fed to step in and preemptively bail out or rescue. And even when they gave us that authority, it was very limited, and we weren't allowed to take that much risk. The statute says that even those emergency powers you can only lend if the president of the New York Fed could be secured to his or her satisfaction. And what does that mean? That means you have to be able to say, we're lending not against air, but we're lending against something that we might have the capacity of deploying to cover losses. Very limited amount of risk. No ability to guarantee, no ability to put capital into institutions. So for that reason, without a willing buyer in the Lehman case, had no good options. And I also write in the book about how, I was very confident we had a willing buyer, but we needed to do what we did in Bear Stearns, which is we had the Fed take some of the risk to make that happen. That I'm very confident we would have done that, and that Hank and Ben would have supported that. Now, people would have been unhappy with us for doing it because again, just to go back to the beginning, it seemed counterintuitive and paradoxical and unfair that would be appropriate or necessary. But again, just look at the damage that happened in the wake of that default.
So I think it's David Axelrod who called your relationship with President Obama a bromance. You did try to talk him out of choosing you as Treasury Secretary, but you ended up being the longest-serving member of his economic team. So talk a little bit about that relationship.
Well, I didn't know him and we met I got this call asking me to come see him in New York in October before the election, and we talked. We had a nice talk, and we had a little bit of common background in the sense we both lived in Southeast Asia when we were kids, or when we were younger, and our parents were sort of in the same profession, his mother and my father. But we didn't know him, and he said to me after we talked, he said, I might have to ask you to come to Washington, and I said that I didn't do that, and I had a bunch of good reasons for that. And I think that helped a little bit, because he knew that I wasn't eager to come do this, and tried to talk him out of it. But then we had to spend a lot of time together, and we went through a lot of ugly, messy, horrible decisions together, and I just have the most, the amazing admiration for him, because he's, for me at least, all that you wanted, much more than you could have hoped for in a president, because all he cared about was trying to figure out what was the right thing to do, what was going to be the most effective thing in avoiding the most damage, getting the economy growing as quickly as possible. He wasn't going to let the short-term political costs of that interfere with what was right. He was both very supportive of the path we agreed on, stuck with it, but he also was very hard on us, very hard on me, in the sense of subjecting my recommendations to pretty tough internal debate, deliberation. He was never paralyzed by that, but he did the right thing, which is to make sure that he was going to look at all options before he embraced what I laid out. I thought he was just a great decision maker, very brave, very smart, very creative at that moment where it mattered so much. I mean, I'll tell you one small story. We had the first phone call we had in the transition with the vice president-elect and the chief of staff and maybe a couple other people. There was a call to talk about his economic agenda in the first term, and I began and said, well, Mr. President-elect, you're going to prevent a second Great Depression. That's what your economic agenda is going to be. And he snapped at me on the phone, and he said, well, I just want you to know that's not enough for me. I'm not going to be defined by what I prevented. And I admire the fact that he was willing to understand that economic imperative was central. Nothing was possible without averting the worst crisis. But he was focused on how he was going to figure out a way to create a governing coalition to make some progress against all the many other challenges we face as a country. And I admired that ambition and his capacity to look through the immediate imperative and devote the capital you needed to the imperative, but still look beyond it to these other challenges we face as a country.
So you have some great mottos that seem to be more broadly applicable than in a financial crisis, but mottos for life. Plan beats no plan. Be for stuff, not just against stuff. And talk a little bit about how these affected you during the debate inside the administration in early 2009, when a number of people were arguing for nationalizing the banks, and you stood pretty much alone against that.
Well, it wasn't really a debate about whether we should nationalize or not nationalize, because it was possible that if banks were unable to raise enough capital to give themselves the resources to survive great like losses, then we were going to put a lot more capital in, and people would call that nationalization. And that might have been unavoidable and desirable in that context. But I think what I learned early in life about how you make decisions context is that you have to surround yourself with people who are not just reasonably smart and ethical and people you can trust with a diversity of backgrounds, experience, who have enough, who have capacity for conviction, are willing to say what they're for, are willing to take the risk in saying, well, how about this? Because mostly what you find in these cases is that people want to debate the problem, say it's not a problem, hope it'll go away, or just describe the challenges. And you can't have any effect on the choices you have to make if all you can do is describe your concern. The concern is important, it's very valuable, but it doesn't get you to a choice. So what I try to do always was just to have the table, around a table, a group of people who are prepared to go relentlessly through all the available choices and try to sort through the best of the bad ones and try to figure out which risks were the better risks to take, what the cost of the mistakes would be, could you correct those mistakes because you're going to make mistakes, and to help people think through those kind of choices. And that's the discipline I tried to bring to these choices in a crisis. And so, I always use plan beats no plan as just a good short version of trying to convince people that they had to decide what they were for, not just what they were against. And what the president did, which was very good, is again trying to let there be enough competition for diagnosis and ideas that he could have a better feel for what was the best among those bad choices. And I write in the book about how what happened over time as we worked through those choices is that the alternatives, most of them couldn't survive 30 minutes of debate because they're well-intentioned, but they had just bad risk reward. They were much too risky relative to the return, or they're deeply unrealistic, or we had no authority to do them, or they assumed the unicorns would exist or something like that. But you have to work through those things that sort of suck the hope out of them where there's no hope and expose people to their infirmities.
So talk a little bit about the toll this took on your life and on your family. What was it like to have The Daily Show pay a visit to your house?
The Daily Show, they had a lot of fun with me. I think the president said in the Oval Office, we used to have these morning meetings on the economy, really terrible. And I remember him coming to the Oval Office morning and saying, seriously, it's like the second time you're on Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live, it was not very good. But I loved my work, and I had great people around me, and a very supportive president, and it wasn't, it was not so fun for me sometimes, but it's very hard on your families. It's nothing like, families of people who serve in the military or in the fire department or first responders. But it's still hard because, they have no privacy, and they never see you. And when you're around, you're not there. When you're present, you're not really present. So it's not really fun for them.
So there were these repeated misperceptions of you, both before you became Treasury Secretary and during the time that you served. Rahm Emanuel's wife told you that you must be looking forward to returning to your nice career at Goldman Sachs. And there's a great interview, a great anecdote in the book about your meeting with Barbra Streisand. So tell us about that and about why you think it is. You say that people never really got to know you. Why that is.
Well, we were doing stuff that was deeply unpopular. Again, on its face, looked like it was designed to reward the arsonists. And people wrote about me early on, and this perception just became conventional wisdom and hardened very quickly that I'd spent my life at Goldman Sachs. I write about this being at a hearing on the Hill, and this member of the Congressional Oversight Panel said to me, he began a question to me by saying, well, Mr. Geithner, of course you're a banker. And I said, no, actually not a banker. He said, well, you were in banking. And I said, no, I was not in banking. So you were in investment banking. I said, no, never in investment banking. But that perception, partly because that initial description of my past, and partly because of what we were doing, just hardened, became overwhelmingly accepted wisdom. And the way the world works is when those perceptions matter a lot, and when those perceptions harden, they're very hard to break.
So another policy question, some of the fiercest criticism of you during your tenure and of your book has come about the help that was offered for homeowners. And one critic wrote, at every turn on housing, the evidence points to Tim Geithner preferring whatever option put the least pressure on banks rather than actually helping ordinary people.
I know that's a common perception, but it's just a deeply confused perception, and it rests on just a deeply unrealistic sense of what our choices were, what our options were. I mean, we had a Democratic president at the peak of his political power, with Democratic majorities in both houses. I think some of the best housing talent in the country working for him. A lot of progressive economists, all the right incentives, understanding housing was terrible. And it was getting worse still. And he put enormous pressure on all of us to try to figure out how we could do more to make it more likely people wouldn't lose their homes. And, but it was a terrible recession. Millions of people lost their jobs. And the scale of those problems, there were 11 million Americans underwater. Negative equity at the peak was $700 billion. And the scale of those challenges were just vast relative to the resources authority we had. And we were unable to relax those constraints in our authority, unable to get more authority from Congress, unable to get more resources on a material scale. And we were definitely slower and less creative than I think I would have liked, and I think we ultimately were in using the authority we had. We did ultimately help millions of people stay in their homes and refinance, and we did put a floor under house prices and lay the conditions for recovery. But ultimately, what it took was when people started to get jobs again. That was when you started to see the pain start to ebb a little bit. Things starting to get better, because again, once you had an income again, you were going to be more likely to be able to stay current in your mortgage, and the scale of that stuff just wasn't large enough. But again, it wasn't because we didn't know it was terrible. It had nothing to do with helping the banks. I mean, it's just upside down. I mean, if we had been able to get $700 billion from the Congress and use it to help people stay current in their mortgages or reduce their mortgage balance, that would have been terrific for the banks. Banks would have loved that. It would have just taken a whole bunch of losses off their table. In some sense, what the stress test was designed to do, the stress test, remember the core of it was to say, we're going to say, these are the losses you banks would face. Foreclosures, defaults by businesses, if it was a Great Depression. So the purpose of the stress test was to point out and make it possible for banks to withstand those losses, to illustrate that we'd force them to have enough capital they could withstand those losses. So their criticism of the program is correct in the sense that they were inadequate, but it's deeply confused in terms of what the options were and what our motivations were.
It is one thing that confused me a little bit, because you do write at the end of the book, I wish we had expanded our housing programs earlier to relieve more pain for homeowners. But I actually think your book is a quite compelling defense of what you did do and why. So is it really true that you would do things differently, that you would do more?
Well, let's separate these two things. Again, I try to be very open with this in the book. Within the scope of the authority we had, we did pretty persistent innovation, evolution, expansion of our programs to try to get more traction, because they were disappointing in their reach. But we didn't do that. We were learning as we were doing it. If we had full knowledge at year one of what we had year 4 and could have done it all earlier, that would have been great. Is that possible? It's possible, I guess. But again, we had some pretty excellent housing people. A lot of knowledge, right incentives, President of the United States putting enormous pressure on us. But anyway, that's one thing I say. So yeah, if we had expanded those things more quickly, had more traction earlier within the authority, that would have been great. But the big constraint was on, I'll just give you an example. Pretty ironic example. When Paulson got authority to put Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship, authority to put capital into them, which was necessary to prevent their collapse, Congress did not give the Secretary of the Treasury any power over what they did. Just power to give them money, not power to influence what they did. So I'll give you an example of what that meant. So You guys understand there's a good economic case for principal reduction in financial crises, particularly for people at the risk of losing their homes. So we spent a lot of time looking at the case for principal reduction. We came to the judgment, not as early as I think I should have, that there was a pretty good case for doing it, having Fannie and Freddie do it. So we went into this big effort with Fannie and Freddie to convince them to do a targeted program of principal reduction that would have benefited hundreds of thousands of people. We had no authority to force them to do it. We laid out the numbers for them, tried to make the economic case for doing it. They didn't want to do it. So even though they existed because of the money we were giving them in capital, it came with no authority. Why was that? It was because Democratic Congress did not want to give a Republican president authority over controlling their things. So that constraint on authority was very consequential, unable to relax it. So you could say it's a failure, too, of ours, that we were unable to relax the constraint. But it's a very different criticism from saying that we left unexploited, unused authority would have been hugely powerful in that context.
So there are tons of good questions from the audience, and some fall into categories, so I'm going to start with this one. What have you learned about navigating the U.S. political system during a crisis, requiring immediate and decisive action, and the international political system?
I don't think I learned very much about politics. I'm not. I don't understand I don't really understand that place, and it's a kind of a. It's kind of a soul-crushing experience to go through. There's just so much hypocrisy and adolescent posturing, and it's not very fun. I didn't learn very much about that. In politics and internationally or here in Washington, the most important thing you can do is to try to figure out what are the interests and incentives and beliefs and constraints of the people you're negotiating with. That's important because unless you have a better feel for those things, there's no way you can have any chance of moving them or finding where your interests might overlap, might be coincident, might be complementary. So you need to come to these discussions with at least a willingness to try to understand what your opponents or your critics or your counterparts think about the world, even if it's a very different view. And if you don't agree with that view, you have to understand it because you still have to figure out a way to find the capacity for compromise. And this country has over time demonstrated pretty remarkable pragmatic capacity for compromise on reform. We just seem to have lost our way for the moment. We'll rediscover it at some point, but it does take that. It just takes effort and a bit of appreciation for for where you can find some complementary interests.
So please compare the European to the U.S. response to the financial crisis.
Well, ours was better. I mean, they had a harder problem in many ways. It's I think a federation of 17 countries, no institutions for common strategy. But like many Americans thought was ideal in the fall of '08, for the first 3 years of crisis. And some Americans say, still think we would have been better for us. And for the first 3 years of the crisis, and this is a pretty helpful illustration of the consequences of a different strategy, they decided that they would, put some fuel in the fire. Not just let the fire burn, but they thought the fire was going to be just and, put a bunch of deserving brutal pain on the more profligate investors, banks, governments. And then they induced a bunch of additional austerity, even by countries that had plenty of resources, very strong fiscal positions. And those two things caused, almost Great Depression-like outcomes in large parts of Europe. And they flirted over and over again with the risk of complete collapse of the euro area. And then in August of 2012, they decided that strategy wasn't a very good strategy. And so they reversed course, relaxed the austerity, and basically, rhetorically, if not in reality, they stacked a bunch of money in the window, the ECB did, to try to calm the fires of the panic. And they bought themselves a much more room now to begin to reform. But they're a good they're a good natural experiment in the cost of the alternative strategy. It's very painful, and it's not the austerity they induced was not just the avoidable fiscal austerity they induced, but if you let financial markets live with panic-like conditions for a long period of time, which they did for 3 years, it's devastating on the capacity of businesses to expand, to borrow, to hire people, retain people. It's just devastating. Good natural experiment. So if people like that alternative, then you should go live in Spain.
So there's a question here. Do you think Fannie and Freddie will be reconstructed? And if so, how and when? And I have to add on to that just a little note. Do you think it's ironic that some of the institutions that you are accused of treating so favorably are now suing you for their favorable treatment? And I don't mean you personally, obviously, but included in that, Fannie and Freddie and AIG.
I do think it's ironic that, I mean, just so you know the context of this stuff, there are, this is a rescue that most people viewed as way too generous to the arsonists and unjust, unfair, and yet the government is being sued for making too much money for the taxpayer on the largest, most riskiest things we did in the case of those three institutions. Do I think Fannie and Freddie will be reformed? That's where you started?
Yep.
Yeah, at some point. I do. I mean, I think that it's going to take a while because this political system, again, can't really do anything now. And this is a complicated thing. It's a very risky reform process because as you've written about eloquently, what produced the mess in Fannie and Freddie was this coalition of real estate interests, well-intentioned housing advocates, and banks. Pretty powerful coalition. A little bit of left, progressives, a little bit of market in that coalition. We called it the housing industrial complex. And they have a pretty strong grip on the political system. And so I always felt, at least when I was there, that not good to rush this, because if you tried to rush the reform process, I know it doesn't look like a rushing it, but if you try to rush the reform process, the risk is you'd strengthen the hand of that coalition, and they'd try to recreate a set of conditions that were probably not sensible. A badly designed, excessively generous subsidy to housing with a bunch of bad incentives for the institutions at the core of that. So I think it's okay if it takes some time. I know it doesn't seem ideal, but it's okay if it takes some time. The housing market's got a long way to go to heal. Private capital is not really coming back with alacrity into that market. Government's still really the only thing in town. Economy is not that strong still. So it should be a gradual process, and you want to run a legislative process that maximizes the chance that the reforms, the successor regime, is dramatically better than the one you had before, and that might take some time.
So this could be a short answer or a long answer, and I'm going to ask the question on the chance that the answer is a long one. What are your thoughts about the current controversy around high-frequency trading?
I think it's a necessary, just, desirable level of attention to a problem that has no obvious, easy solutions yet. It's going to take a long time to figure out a better framework, but it's worth the attention. So I'm for the controversy and the attention, and hopefully it produces some changes that make those markets have a bit more integrity and a little less risk of catastrophic damage.
So in the book, you are quite pleased with Dodd-Frank. You think it really did make a difference and go a long way toward making the financial system safer. But you also write about the very thing in this person's question, and somebody would like you to comment on why the revised rules for the FDIC guarantee authority and the limitations on Fed authority are problematic. So talk about that in the context of some of the things that aren't so great about Dodd-Frank.
Let me just describe two of the most important things Dodd-Frank did. We did put in place, a lot of credit to Elizabeth Warren, a new framework for consumer protection that is much better designed, more powerful, better accountability, and will be better, not perfect, but better at preventing the level of predatory stuff and abuse that happened. Against the risk of future financial crises, we have much better authority to impose much more conservative constraints on risk-taking much more broadly. Remember, before the crisis in 2007, the ones that existed applied to about 40% of the financial system. They were too thin, too. But now they're much more conservative, and they're applied much more broadly. Banks can't, through acquisition, be more than 10% of the banking system. That's a much more restrictive limit on consolidation, concentration that exists anywhere in the planet. We force big banks to hold much more capital for the same amount of risk, any mortgage relative to a small bank. This is a systemic surcharge. And there's better bankruptcy-like authority to dismember large institutions like Lehman, Bear Stearns, AIG that we didn't have in the panic. Those are all good things. But in that sort of deeply populist moment in Washington, they took away some of the firefighting authority that was so important to protect people from a much worse recession. They took away the FDIC, or conditioned the FDIC's guarantee authority, and I think less consequentially did a little tightening up, with stuff I recommended actually on the Fed. We said, for example, I thought the Fed shouldn't be able to do firm-specific interventions in the future like AIG or Bear Stearns, only generally available stuff. If you want to do firm-specific things, that should be left to the government. That was my view. The guarantee authority thing is very consequential because it was one of the most effective things that was done to limit the force of the panic in the fall of 2008, and it's the only way you break panics. One of the only ways you can break panics. And what happened was Congress, although it wasn't very controversial at the time, Congress got a little caught up in a belief that in finance, the fire station is what caused fires. It's not true. It doesn't happen that way. Or they got caught up in this belief that somehow if you limit the tools available to the fire station, you make fires less likely. That's also not true. But still they got caught up in that basic belief. So they limited, conditioned that authority. And what that means is that, because politicians are not going to rush to do the right thing in a panic because it's so deeply unpopular, what it means is that the Congress will be late, like it was this time. They'll be late in the future when it's severe, and that's going to be a very costly thing. I still think on balance, though, if you look at the reforms, although they're messy and complicated and imperfect, these core reforms around limiting risk are very powerful, and they're very well designed. And they're going to buy us they have the chance of buying us a long period of relative stability, not permanent. There's nothing permanent in this, because as people become more confident, eventually risk will migrate around those constraints, and you face the risk again of something more severe. But on balance, even with those limitations, the constraints in the fire station, the reforms I think are really pretty good.
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question. And this one is, are you still doing your taxes with TurboTax?
Oh, excellent question. No, I got a good education, though, in the complexity of the tax system, and generally believe in paying for advice.
All right, well, thank you all very much.